Hello and welcome to Daily Politics on Trust TV. On this program, we discuss issues around politics, policy, and governance. I am Shafiu Suleiman. Thanking you for joining us. In the face of deepening poverty and hunger being experienced in the country, some citizens have been attacking trucks conveying food items across some states. This was followed by reported cases of raids of warehouses in the nation's capital, Abuja, and elsewhere by some hungry and angry youths and the elderly. This development is a fallout of the cost of living crisis rocking the country as a result of removal of petroleum subsidy by the current administration and a crippling inflation that leads to high cost of prices of food beyond the reach of the ordinary citizens. Concerned Nigerians have been reacting to the deteriorating cost of living crisis with a call on leadership at both federal and state to take pragmatic and proactive measures to avert a looming anarchy staring the country in the face if the wave of criminality being exhibited by the rampaging hoodlums taking advantage of the hunger situation is not adequately tackled. It is against this backdrop we'll be engaging with a social and political rights activist, Hashim, to get his perspective on how best to address this challenge. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
But before we commence the conversation, here are some tidbits. The organized private sector has expressed concern about the spate-up looting of trucks conveying food and raw materials by suspected hoodlums, warning it can lead to a shutdown of industries across the country. Members of the OPS gave the warning on Monday in separate interviews with newsmen, just as miscreants attacked trucks conveying building materials and spaghetti in Ogun and Kaduna states. Also, the federal government on Monday said it will start the distribution of free grains to states this week. Now, several trucks and warehouses, mostly owned by manufacturers and other members of the OPS, have come under attacks from hoodlums. And more facts have emerged over the Sunday looting of a private warehouse in the Karmo community of the Federal Capital Territory, FCT. Now, Daily Trust reported how some hoodlums and their numbers attacked a government warehouse in Gwagwa town, as well as a private one owned by a trader in neighboring Karmo town, all located within Abuja Municipal Area Council in the FCT. The Gwagwa warehouse, which was attacked around 7 a.m. and lasted till 9 a.m., was owned by the Agricultural and Rural Development Secretariat of the Federal Capital Territory Administration, FCTA. Now, branded bags of maize with government marks were stolen from the facility by the vandals, with others taking other valuables attached to the building like roofing sheets, windows, and gates. Now, we'll take a short break, and when we return, our conversation begins. Stay with us. Thank you very much for staying with us. And once again, welcome to the program, Hashim.
Thank you very much for having me.
Right, you've had the tidbits, the first somehow related to the second. The first has to do with the private sector, the organized private sector, now worried over the incessant attacks on their facilities, if you like, on their trucks across some states. Now they are alerting the government, or perhaps warning that if this continues, there's likelihood of shutting down their industries, all over the country. What do you make up with that one?
Well, it actually describes the current state of confusion that has actually greeted us as a nation. And then, of course, it tells us very clearly that it's an opportunity for us to do an appraisal of our democratic journey since 1999 to say of a truth as a state if we have delivered dividends of democracy. Recently, a report on the performance of democracy for Nigeria was released, and Nigeria was not doing well at all. We have been doing about 4.02 to 4.06 in the last 5 years, and that tells us, in fact, the report statistically mention that Nigeria has not been making progress democratically. And that tells us that it is very important for us to do a review of our kind of democracy and find a way to adapt it to development. And again, it is a conversation that borders around, yes, democracy is not about delivering dividends of democracy, but it is also about delivering policy handles that allows the people to be able to vent and, of course, people for thrive. Developing and welfare of the people is the first order of the state. Taking care of their welfare and government in itself has actually failed in that regard. And putting up a policy that allows for people to be doing what we saw on TV is actually a state of worrisome. And I tell people just a few days ago that it is a symptom of what we call a dangerous symptom of a revolution. That when people get hungry, they get angry at the state, and then of course they tear apart everything that we are seeing. What we saw on TV is very un-Nigerian. It is actually a terrible symptom that I think government must go away from its regular sloganeering and respond to it in a practical manner and find some kind of cushion that would allow for all of these things to subside. But to get this thing done, governors for the first time in their life must see this as a way of delivering services and delivering good governance. It is not an opportunity to start relooting or start, finding a way to become very greedy with stuff that I think governors at this point should please. It is actually a kind of plea to governors at all levels, particularly state governors, to please take this very seriously, because they are going to be very critical in this policy handshake that will allow for this particular problem to be resolved.
Okay, before we talk about the other aspect now, because you talked about the fact that democracy is not actually working for us, and that is the reason because of the deficit in terms of the deliverables. That's why people are resorting to self-help.
Absolutely.
But then there are also concerns around, crime or criminality, associated with some of this uprisings, if you like, or kind of actions, citizens' action.
Absolutely.
Now, take for instance what happened in Abuja. Yes, a set of people, a group of people went to attack a facility owned by the FCTA, where, food items, if you like, were stored and all of that. And then another set of people also went to attack a private warehouse belonging to a Nigerian also struggling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we, reconcile these issues? The nagging hunger, if you like, or the rampaging hunger,
and the criminality
that comes with it.
Obviously, what we have simply done is that we have created the inroad for this kind of criminality to thrive. Because most importantly is that, look, when you are not unanimous in your decision, or you don't have a collective positioning, it is difficult for a set of people to go attacking. What we have done is that we have created a common denominator, and that is hunger. Look, when a lion has to choose between satisfying his hunger and demonstrating loyalty to his keeper, he will actually have to choose hunger, because that is actually who a lion is, a predator. One thing that is very clear is that a man's hunger actually has a way of redefining a lot of things about him. It defines his mood, it defines his upkeep, even in the jungle. It is clearly, classically mentioned that self-help would always come to bear when a man is left with that only option. Hunger is something that is not only intrinsic, but has to do with a man's survival. And you know that when it comes to the issue of survival, people must, and what we have done is that government has created that unanimous decisioning for criminality to come in. In the past, there would have been a set of young people who would have actually blocked that kind of situation and said, look, you can't do this. You can't do this. Okay? Because they would have. So what we have done over the years for us as a country is not because the state in itself has protected us. It is because we have created this sort of Pan-African nature of policing.
Some value,
where
system.
people have actually taken upon themselves to protect their own society. So a lot of young people would have said, no, you can't come into my community and do this. But when they are all hungry, then it becomes a common denominator for everybody.
It becomes a uniting factor.
Absolutely. So we left that room.
And you could see that, happening, if you like, or come to bear, and the kind of people that attack some of these facilities.
Absolutely.
Across religious line, across ethnic lines, and all of that. People are unanimous in this, even though some will say largely youth's demography, but then the elderly too.
Absolutely.
So you could
religion and ethnicity are just artificial. The problem in this country is actually between the state, the elite, and the masses. The problem in this country is about addressing the fulcrum, which is the issue of responding to the yearnings of the people. I can guarantee you one thing: Nigerians are not asking government for too many things.
That's right.
They are asking you, give us basic things, give us electricity, give us shelter, and you whoever they want to rule, just go ahead and do it.
That's right.
But if you give us food and an enabling environment, you give us electricity, I can tell you that we can function very well. For Nigerians who have done well in terms of performance everywhere in the world, those economies have not given them anything special.
Yeah, beyond the enabling environment.
Once you give Nigerians the enabling environment, and look at what the Qatari government mentioned yesterday, that look, Nigerians are known to be very innovative and very productive, but the only reason is that they have not done so on the shores of Nigeria. They have excelled more outside the shores of that. And that is a message that I think the government should take advantage. Why do we excel more outside the shores? Because the enabling environment are not functional. And the president, in his comments and his response, tactically agreed with him and said, look, if anybody is going to ask you for a bribe, please look out for me. It tells you very clearly that even him knows that his own system is actually clogged with some level of irregularities.
And some see it as some sort of indictment on his own party.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yes. Okay, how do we juxtapose this? Because we're talking about, a situation that warrants this kind of citizens' action that we're seeing. And then also talking about, how to address it fundamentally without necessarily, doing much other than providing the enabling environment, just like you said. Today, as we speak, people can no longer go to their farms, to even produce what they eat, not to talk of exporting or there. Because some substantial number of farmers in Nigeria are subsistent, in terms of, if they can farm where they can feed their families, they are okay. So the environment is not there because of the level of insecurity, for instance. And for those who have been having, jobs to do, are also finding it difficult, to cope because of the level of inflation in the country. The purchasing power has gone down drastically and all of that. So literally, the environment to address some of this problem is not there.
Absolutely.
So how do we recreate this environment?
One is policies. Policies will have to deal with the issue of safety. It will deal with public safety and security. It will deal with the issue of forex. It will deal with the issue of tax. It will deal with the issue of farm input. Policies in this country over the years have been very inconsistent. And that in itself has been what has brought us here today. That is one. Two is the sincerity of governance. Good governance has been seen not as a privilege, has been seen rather as a privilege rather than as a right. Okay, so people who deliver good governance are hailed in this country. No, forgetting that they actually deliver what but the reason why we are hailing them is because in the midst of others, that at least we have seen one who has actually done his job in a very responsive manner, and that in itself has created the issue that we have. Thirdly is that the social charter and the social contract between the people and their own government has never been formal for so many years, and that in itself has made it very difficult for a government to respond or to subject itself and make itself accountable to its own citizen. That in itself has been very faulty. Then there is an arrangement that has been put in place as a measure to be able to check, and that is the parliament. Unfortunately, over the years, the parliament has demonstrated that it could not be trusted. So Nigerians as a citizen are suffering the consequences of bad leadership, are suffering the consequences of being in an environment where the state does not care about
There's lack of checks.
And that in itself has consistently affected every sector, every subsector that has affected the lives of every citizen, and it has reduced the quality of lives. Life expectancy has reduced drastically in this country, not because of anything, but because of the inability of citizens to get that. Okay, they say that there's a renewed hope. Whether that hope renewed the lifespan. But what we know too well is that people no longer have hope, and that in itself has contributed to the number of Japa syndrome that we have also seen today.
Yeah, lack of hope, and perhaps also disconnect, or if you like, there's deficit in terms of trust.
Absolutely.
In governance.
Absolutely.
And so now looking at this dynamics and perhaps talking about the checks and, so many things attached. One, we're talking about extracting leadership accountability.
Absolutely.
Or governance accountability. The parameters are not there, or the parameters are not there, but they're not working. We're talking about the legislative arm, which ordinarily should exercise oversight, and of course check the excesses of the executive, but it happens to be part of the arrangement. That's one. And then two, the laws, part of the component of the law, for instance, citizens can also initiate certain actions, especially when it comes to legislation. They can recall, for instance. But the laws are also not, they are also very cumbersome, if you like, in terms of making that happen. And then, on the other hand, we have weaponization of poverty. So, people would have to, be responsible for what is happening today. A number of people would have to, had to collect certain, gratis, if you like, spaghetti and the rest of it to vote. That has been the reason behind their decision to vote, certain people into government. And today they are bearing the brunt. So how do they get out of this court?
There's a conspiracy against citizens in this country by the elites. There is an elite capture of the society. That conspiracy in itself has made it very clear that the best way to retain power is to keep people perpetually in poverty. And like you said, they have weaponized it, knowing fully well that a time will come that they will exploit that hunger as an advantage for them to retain power. Just over the weekend, I did an analysis over personnel who have been in governance for over 25 years. There are people who have been in the Senate for 4 consecutive terms. There are people who have spent 8 years as governors, spent 8 years as ministers. That is 16 years. And people have lived on public offices, lived on public funds, and then of course the arrogance that comes, that they also put forward in terms of responding to the deficit they have created over the years tells you very clearly that they are no longer in touch with realities. We saw recent forensic reports that emanated from the last 8 years and the level at which people dip their hand into public office. So it tells you very clearly that the only orphan that we have in this country are the citizens and the masses. But when the push comes to shove, that the elite will always cooperate. And at that time, the issue of tribalism and religion becomes very artificial because it no longer matters. What matters more is how to consistently unite that front to retain and to maintain power. And that in itself is the position we are today. And the only way out of it is for us to redefine our leadership selection process. If we redefine that, and the people for themselves, again for the first time, begin to have a way of using the ballot as the only avenue to vote in or vote out governance, then it will be an opportunity for responsive and responsible leadership to take over this country.
Okay, talking about, finding solutions, homegrown solution, if you like, or, citizen-driven solutions to some of these problems. Again, if you look at, yes, we talk about the fact that the elites, the political elites and so on, are detached with the realities. But shouldn't they be worried looking at this science, if people can unite, come out in numbers within a twinkle of an eye, approach a warehouse, they perhaps know the location and what is even there, approach the warehouse, vandalize it, take anything they want to take, including roofing sheets and all of that. So for those who could not find something to take in terms of the food items, they were also looking for anything that is valuable, something that can be sold. And so what does this speak in terms of the level of poverty? Because beyond hunger, we're talking about multidimensional poverty.
Absolutely.
Over 133 million Nigerians are under this index.
I think we should be very worried. We should be very worried, not even as a state, but again, even generally as a society. Because just 2 days ago, before the OPS release, I had actually issued a release warning private food producers and transporters to say, look, it is very important to actually exercise some caution and some restraint. And the consequences of this, I'll tell you, is that in some parts of the countries, food prices would jack again artificially, not because of the extant or existing challenge, but because of the inability to have access to those markets, because people will no longer be able to transport. So those items that are saturated in Lagos might not be able to find their way to the southwest and into the north, and those food items from the north might not be able to find their way down south. The only good thing is that the one that will come from up north are still very much raw materials, tomatoes and other perishables and stuff, but those ones that are coming from
processed,
the south already processed, just spaghetti, noodles, and these are high-risk products now. And I mentioned to you, look, even when you go to the superstore or supermarket and you buy stuff, please block it down your boot, because you are not too sure who will come to attack. Who is watching you? Because as it is now,
people are desperate.
We live in a precarious time. It is actually very precarious, that the desperation of people and a single click. And one thing you cannot control is actually the fury of a mob.
That's right.
Once a mob decides to attack you for no single reason, just because one person sells the narrative that there is something in this vehicle that we could all take, and they attack you, it takes only happy stance to rescue you from out of that. So we need to be very, very careful. And this is actually some kind of public order that I think security agencies should begin to issue out there. But generally, coming back to the discussion, is to say, look, we must find some level of immediate, urgent, rapid response that would allow us to mitigate this ongoing challenge.
So are the elites ready for this consensus? Because it appears they felt insulated. A number of them are detached with the realities.
And I will tell you why they are not.
Okay.
And this is simply put, they are blinded by their greed. It is only a matter of time that this whole thing, like tsunami, will actually come down very heavily. And the reason is because they already have an existing template they use to subdue the people. Not also allowing those, of course, because they don't have political consultants and all of that, that will also tell them that, look, this template does no longer work. You must shift ground to be able to allow for some level of empowerment to come in and allow you to do. But what you see is, as deep as people get into poverty, some people are rising in the pinnacle and flying and smiling to the bank on a regular basis. And it tells you very clearly that our commonwealth has become the only weapon that they have consistently used against us. And each time the people made an attempt to want to respond, they just put in some kind of little soft palliative, just one bag of rice, and people again go back to their cocoon. And I think there is a need for government and statecrafts to sit down again and reappraise this particular situation. Unfortunately, we don't want to spell doom, but what we see growing might actually come to consume all of us if we don't do anything urgently.
Right, okay, we have to, there's a stitch in time, save nine. Oh, okay, thank you very much, Salahuddin Hashim, for your informed perspective. It's about time we take a break, and when we return, we'll also be looking at another key component of our democratic experiment, rather the leadership recruitment process and how it is being reformed. We'll take a break, and when we return, the conversation continues. Stay with us. Thank you very much for staying with us. And now we'll be looking at the prosecution, if you like, of electoral offenders, especially as regards to the 2023 elections in Nigeria. Now, there is a collaboration with the Nigeria Bar Association, and I think the electoral umpire now, and other stakeholders to prosecute those found wanting during the conduct of the last general elections across the country. And these are officials of the INEC itself, that is the electoral management body, politicians and others who have been involved in illegal activities during the election. And this is perhaps, some would say, Salahuddin, apt, looking at what transpired during the election and how culpable some of the stakeholders were found. Yeah. To what extent will this prosecution of electoral offenders sanitize the electoral system?
Yeah, it will sanitize the system. To be very honest, it has become one of the major and the holy grail to rescue the democracy from the current challenge that it is currently confronted with. But I can guarantee you again, just like the previous discussion we had, I hope it doesn't end in a farce. And I'll tell you why. The reason why I hope not is that INEC nationally, across the whole offices, has less than 100 lawyers, less than 100 prosecutors. Yeah. That is one. Two is the fact that there are over 190,000 approximately wards in this country. There are over 360 federal constituencies. There are 109 senatorial districts. There are 774 local government areas. So you ask me one thing, that how does this practically, considering the infrastructure available, we want to deal with this issue? So you realize that what we do most of the time is simply sloganeer. That is one. Two is the fact that electoral impunity has become one of the biggest monster that has confronted our entire electionary process. Electoral fraud leads to electoral impunity. Electoral impunity leads to what we now call voter disconnect from our democracy. Okay, no, it leads to a voter apathy. Okay, electoral fraud leads to electoral impunity. Impunity leads to voter apathy.
And that also affects the outcome.
Exactly. Then the voter apathy now leads to people's disconnect from the reality and agreeing to the process. And that in itself affects the entire value chain of the outcome of the entire process. Then what this does is that the process of any election is as important as the outcome and the result of that particular election. So if the process is faulty, and we have seen instances and cases of people who have agreed that they actually declare some results under duress, and we saw on national TV a particular senator asking a senator friend that, how did you manage, even though you were not on the ballot? That in itself tells us the level of electoral impunity that we are actually confronted with. And we saw a senator who stood up on the chamber, the red chamber, and declared himself as a judicial hitman, where he says most of his colleagues will always come to rally around him to help him deal with certain issues. It tells you very clearly, like I mentioned earlier, that there is an elite capture of the society, and there is a need for
including the institutions.
Absolutely. No, the institution itself is actually weak because individuals there have actually created that weakness for it. Section 100, Section 50 or thereabout of the Electoral Act mention clearly the kind of processes and procedures that are required for you to be able to prosecute judiciously. And I'll give you another gap, another challenge. Most of the officers who actually help in terms of arrest in any election offenses situation are not resident in the states where that issue happened.
To provide...
They were actually posted from outside, and once elections are over, they actually go back to where they were posted. And they are the ones who made the arrest. The ingredients of any judicial process is actually in evidence.
That's right.
And in the kind of how convincing.
The evidence.
How do you then go to start calling the man who has left back to Ekiti or to now come back to... You realize that it is almost improbable for us to do that. So it tells us very clearly that for us to do this, we must be very deliberate to strengthen the institution and strengthen the process. But the fact remains very clear that the Electoral Act as amended is not sufficient enough in terms of provision.
Okay, there are gaps that need to be addressed. Okay, let's look at the figures. For instance, INEC is saying that it is handing over 215 persons arrested for various electoral offenses by the Nigerian police during this election. So, and then this out of 774 persons, arrested. So a substantial number of these people that were arrested are still not being prosecuted. Does this speak to the deficit in terms of the legal, the legal, or rather the prosecution requirement?
The sufficiency of it. 2 is the investigation in itself may not have been concluded. 3 is that when you do a further disaggregation, you will realize that these people that they have decided to finally hand over are either people who are just like what you call petty crime within the process and all that. I can guarantee you that political affiliation has become one of the biggest barriers to the issue that borders around prosecution of electoral offenders. And until we insulate all of this political interference and make it a more independent approach. And that was why the conversation around unbundling INEC has always been on the front burner. If we don't unbundle INEC in itself is saddled with too many responsibilities. And to be very fair on them. And I've mentioned it everywhere. INEC is the most progressive and the most functional agency of government since the return to democracy. They have consistently adapted and reformed despite the challenges. And that for me tells you one thing, that when governors know, and government and those who are in the government corridors know too well that the only corridor to power is INEC, then they will put it all the energy and force. So that tells you very clearly that we know where our strength lies and we know where our reform can work. If you do any advocacy to INEC, and it is something that is very functional and that will add value to the entire program, they will actually do it. Disability issue have done it. They have provided magnified glasses. They have done it. They have provided a lot of what you see. In fact, some of the things that you don't see in some climes, you see it INEC in terms of practice that they have actually adopted. And that is actually a kudos to them.
Right. Talking about, the deficiency, if you like, or the deficit or the gap, in the Electoral Act. You talked about unbundling INEC, which many have canvassed before now. And part of it was also to come up with a department, that perhaps will be dealing with these legal matters. Because even INEC at some point has been, raising concerns that these legal issues have slowed down its ability to perform. A number of cases that are pending, a number of cases that they had to dispense with before they would be able to conduct elections and so on. So how are we pushing this as civil society organizations or within the civil society? How much of this advocacy, especially now that the constitution is being amended, and perhaps, so what do we do? How do we address this gap?
Yeah, I think in the spirit of the Orosai report now, it is classically almost impossible to start talking about an independent prosecuting agency for offenses like this, because obviously it will run riot of the direction of government.
Trying to trim down.
Absolutely, because they are trying to trim down and harmonize. But again, is to look at where does your power and where does your strength and your interest truly lies. And I think for me, very fundamentally, that if you want to make it a department, fine, but make it a department that is highly mobile, and make it a department that is very functional, and make it a department that is not riddled with bureaucracy, and let it be a very independent unit that would at least be able to do things and drive the process forward. Two is that we need to also redefine our electoral security management in this country, because if you must allow that unit to function in terms of prosecution, then those who gather the evidence, if they leave town and they are redeployed back to their state where their base was, then it is difficult for them. Then the thinking should be, what should be in the interagency consultative committee on electoral security should be looking at going forward as a measure to be able to ensure that those ingredients are kept in a more sacrosanct manner that will allow that unit to function in a more responsive way. And I think finally is to create a lot of independent oversight around the activities of prosecution that we have seen. Because the truth remains that so long as those who sit in certain corridors in public offices, they will continue to frustrate these issues of prosecution. Because I can guarantee you, for everybody that of all the 200 and something person that we have here, even though we know that they are minor thieves, but the fact remains that they are connected to one person or the other. And until you do that demystification, you might not be able to find.
I was actually coming to that. There was an incident in Kaduna during the last elections, and I think a lady was arrested with a number of ballot papers and a number of voters' cards and all of that. But hours later, she was free. And so you begin to ask yourself, who actually negotiated her release, and what happened? Is that the end of the story? And talking about this prosecution, are we likely going to see some of these big wigs, these big politicians who are involved in these malpractices prosecuted? They said there are officials of INEC among this number of people that are being prosecuted. Is it not likely going to be a smoke screen looking at the larger picture?
All of us saw a video of a certain rep member that was actually paraded with over $500,000 on the day of the presidential election. I'm hoping to look out for that name on the list.
The list of those being prosecuted.
Okay, so I'm also looking out to some names of individuals who never, who never attended primaries, whose name never appeared, but eventually won an election. I'm hoping that we'll see that these are the kinds of things that we need to see. If you want to be deliberate, I think there is no gainsaying. That being deliberate does not mean that you should undercut the system. Go full throttle, then at least everybody will know that you are very serious about what you are currently doing. But the moment you begin to apply some level of conditionality into how you respond, then it creates the room for, it is for this. And that in itself has affected us as a people and as a country. And that is why this issue of sectionalization, this issue of ethnic proliferation has actually come into our politics. But the fact is that good is good, irrespective of who is involved. Bad is bad, irrespective of who is involved. If we must prosecute, then let us be very holistic. There are reports out there. I would expect that INEC, beyond what they have, should actually go to the 2023 General Election report and pick
be able to,
and do absolutely. That is the basis that you have. People documented all the incidences that happened. Take that report and begin from there. Then people will know that you are serious. But if you want to begin and you are trying to scratch this, then of course, for me, I don't think there's any integrity in the process.
Now, looking at the jurisdiction, this is a special kind of arrangement. It doesn't go beyond magistrates and maybe the state high courts and all of that. And how, in the event that these cases, need to go beyond these courts, how do we handle it? Should this also be factored into our conversation or into our thinking towards amending the Constitution to make it, I think that is very fundamental, because we must be very forward-looking
in terms of how we want to deal with issues like this. Otherwise, we are still going to continue to go around the circle, because the issue is about how do we want to get these things done. Obviously, we know the bureaucracy with our judicial system. We know too well. For the very first time, judiciary came under spotlight over our electionary process. For the first time, people are no longer looking at the ballot, but people are looking at the courtrooms. And I think, again, it is an opportunity for us to be able to review the activities of judiciary in the entire electoral system and see that we'll be able to put all of those milestones. The issue that borders around jurisdiction is very fundamental. And if jurisdiction is going to come to bear, and in law, it is actually very fundamental. Jurisdiction, jurisprudence. It is something that you cannot play with. So if in itself it has become an infrastructure that is required to be able to prosecute efficiently, then we need to look at that and again advance that review to be able to capture that. Otherwise, INEC becomes very frustrated at some point. And one of the things that I have seen, even in previous cases they have attempted to prosecute, is that those cases have been thrown out for on technical grounds. And technical grounds, jurisdiction can be part of it.
That's it.
Technical ground can be the issue that borders around diligent prosecution. Technical ground can be on a number of, and these are the issues where even the state itself has consistently lost. And you ask yourself why.
I'm talking about the Nigerian Bar Association, members who are going to do this prosecution pro bono, as they said, and then looking at also the processes, how these legal issues are sometimes prolonged today. And then who stands for what, and how do we monitor this to ensure that there is actually justice delivered, at the end of it?
Well, I'm going to try to be nice to the entire bar, because they have been very constructive and contributed to this. But I think, again, the bar needs to do a little bit of some reform on its own internally. Yes, there's is a welcome development to offer this on the pro bono cases as a measure to ensure that justice is served. And I think, for me, this is very fundamental. Secondly, is that the bar itself is the biggest beneficiary of this entire value chain that we are talking about, because it is actually the biggest moment for every lawyer to actually make some good living. People should make living, that is fine. But again, in the process of making living, what are the kind of advisories that you also give to your clientele? And I know that even on this show, shortly before the election, we have come here to say, look, there is a lot of litany of cases that we find in courts today because the bar and their members have not judiciously advised their clients to say, look, this issue, but because of the economy of the process, they would also just say, look, we can take this forward. So I think it is very important that we also attend to this kind of issue. But again, to be very honest, I think the bar has been very forward-looking in terms of how they have constructively contributed to democracy, and I think this is very welcome. But again, the bar must complement the bench, because if the bar and the bench work together on this particular issue, I think we'll be getting somewhere. Right.
Okay, we've already established the fact that it is absolutely fundamental to create this deterrence. Looking at what has been happening over time, election is becoming like a war. In some cases, you find people even committing arson and burning people, in their home, their homes and all of that. People being machetes and all of that. These are, crimes that are being committed of high magnitude and by the same political actors.
Absolutely.
And they go scot-free in most cases. Now, so providing some level of deterrence is absolutely necessary. So, but then taking it to the concluding part, if you like, or realizing the objective is also key. Beyond just the trial or perhaps the announcement of the trial, Nigerians want to see people are actually convicted. Now, how do you think the courts would also take these processes seriously? And of course, expeditious justice delivered?
Okay, two things. One, the court does not work on any emotions or any form of sway, but the court works basically on prima facie.
That's right.
So if you bring sufficient evidence, well, of course, the court will function. But again, if you come to the court and you approach it with flimsy and litany of hearsays, and you have distorted evidence, even if the person is guilty, and you have been able to get the investigators and the prosecutors to have messed up, then the court is handicapped. The court will only function based on what is present. That is one. Two is that the prosecutors and investigators must actually work together very strongly to be able to get this kind of cases to the finish line. Because what we have seen in a lot of cases is that you have seen prosecutors and investigators doing shady job. Investigators will not do a very thorough job, then the prosecutor goes to court and start panting like a ram, and you notice that so eventually it becomes something that is very less attractive to a judge, because he tells you that, look, you cannot come and waste the time of the court, because in itself is contempt, an attempt to waste the time of the court. So the court will throw it out and say, look, I'm not interested, I have better issue to deal with. So even though it is an issue of deterrence, but I think prosecutors and investigators must work together to have a tight presentation that they must go to the court.
Yeah, talking about working together, you know, the courts have their a practice direction, which guides, you know, the prosecution and all of that. So in this case, to have an expeditious hearing, if you like, adhering to the practice direction perhaps would help.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think it is very important that the Court of Appeal should, I think the practice direction also has not been up to date in terms of how you matchmake it with contemporary directions from the reality. So I think, again, the Court of Appeal and the Secretariat of the NJC should again come together and look at the practice direction and say, look, there's a need for us to bring this up to speed with the contemporary happenings within the space. That for me would be one of the best things that would have happened as a lesson that we have learned from 2023, because this election has brought a lot of lessons to tell us that gaps exist in different aspects of our journey.
Thank you very much, Salahuddin Hashim, for your informed perspectives.
Thank you very much for having me.
And viewers, this is a wrap on today's package of Daily Politics. Do join us tomorrow, where we'll be back with another interesting topic and personalities. Until then, I'm Shapiu Suleiman, thanking you for staying with us.